Throughout history and the centuries, there were many royal burial vaults and coffins of kings and queens which were opened. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, had his coffin opened 500 years after his death, and it was found that his body had been remarkably preserved. The coffin this time was opened to check the location of the king's body, but over time there was a lot of desecration of the royal tombs. For example, following the English Civil War, the tombs of Henry VIII's queens were even targeted, and they were smashed to pieces and broken up. Anything that was a symbol of the monarchy was subjected to be desecrated, but over the centuries there were, in particular, a few royal burial vaults and tombs that were repeatedly desecrated and treated disgustingly. In this documentary, we look at these shocking royal burial vaults, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. One of the most barbaric and brutal kings of England was Henry VIII, who is best known for having 6 wives. 2 of these lost their heads inside the Tower of London, as an axeman and swordsman would perform the bloody roles of taking the heads of his wives. But Henry VIII in his final years put a huge amount of weight on, and he would become rather restricted with injuries he had following a jousting accident, which transformed his personality. The king had been smashed off of his horse in his 30s, and following this he became rather tyrannical, and his mood would shift sharply. This coincided with the executions of some of his friends, who he would condemn and then regret these actions. But in 1547, Henry VIII became ill early in the year, and he would succumb to this inside of his chambers in the Palace of Whitehall. However, Henry VIII, following his death, would be buried in a very small vault, which is not in keeping with his reputation and legacy. Today he still remains in this burial vault, despite his wishes being different. However, the vault of Henry VIII would be broken into a number of times, and with this the most infamous king of England was disturbed. On the 28th of January 1547, King Henry VIII died, and his death was one which was rather peaceful. He was attended on by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, and in the end the king slipped away, and he did acknowledge in his life that he had sinned a great deal. But following his death, the king's body was washed inside of his chambers, after it was left a few days before his demise was announced to the Parliament. With this, Edward VI was made king, but Henry VIII's heart and vital organs were removed, and these, it's believed, were then placed in lead caskets or vessels, which were buried in places separate from where his body was laid to rest. After this, the king's body was placed into a coffin, and it was then laid in state in the presence chamber of Whitehall Palace, and was surrounded by burning tapers before it was moved on a huge procession to Windsor Castle, and the church within the castle's walls, St. George's Chapel. Henry VIII stated in his will to his servants and family that he wanted to be buried with his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, who had died following giving birth to King Edward VI. Jane's demise inside of Hampton Court was very sad, and she never made it out of the place alive, as she became sick in the days following giving birth to the heir. But Jane's death changed history forever, as despite giving the king everything he wanted, if she had recovered, then it's unlikely Henry would have had more wives. But her body, minus the heart, which had been buried in Hampton Court Chapel, was taken to St. George's Chapel and was buried in a vault under the floor of the choir, showing her importance. But Henry decided that he wanted to be placed, to begin with, in this vault, before he wanted to be moved to a much larger and grander tomb, which would be placed inside of Westminster Abbey, alongside his father and mother's tomb. The tomb of Henry VIII was planned for many decades before he died, and he wanted this to be a large ornamental tomb which would be bigger and grander than his mother and father's. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, specifically, it would be a quarter bigger, and Italian sculptors tried to work on this, and Henry VIII did argue with them over the tomb's design. However, the king died before the tomb would be finished, and because of this it was never completed, as his children would not invest a huge sum of money to finish it. But because of this, the king's dreams of being buried inside a grand memorial would never occur. The coffin of Henry VIII after his death and embalming was then taken on a huge procession from Whitehall Palace to Windsor Castle. The procession was 4 miles long, and roads had to be widened to allow it to pass by. And the hearse carried the coffin of the king, which was pulled by horses who had been draped in black cloth. But on the coffin was a wax effigy of Henry VIII, covered in jewels and his clothes. This was for many people who witnessed the procession the first time they had seen an image of their king and what he looked like, and the crown was also placed on the coffin. The funeral procession moved towards Sion Abbey, and it was then rested for the evening to have a break, and there have been rumours in the past centuries that whilst it was here, the king's body exploded and that parts of Henry dripped out of the coffin, and then this was licked at by dogs. This may have been caused by the gases building up in the body after death, and this is known to occur. But after the evening, the journey continued on to the burial site, and the coffin of Henry VIII reached Windsor, and it was then carried into the church by 16 yeomen of the guard. Such was the weight of Henry's coffin. The funeral service of Henry VIII then occurred, and his coffin was then lowered into the vault, where it still remains 500 years on. His officers of the household broke their staves of office and threw these into the vault after the coffin. But the burial vault would, throughout the centuries, be disturbed a number of times. Today there is no pomp or ceremony regarding the king's burial site, and it's just a simple marble slab showing where Henry VIII is buried. It says, "In a vault beneath this marble slab are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry VIII, 1537, King Henry VIII, 1547, King Charles I, 1648, and an infant child of Queen Anne. This memorial was placed here by command of King William IV, 1837, but Henry VIII was disturbed a number of times, mostly to bury the others inside of the vault with him, and he would be buried next to someone who he would consider his greatest enemy. The most important person inside of the burial vault after Henry VIII is King Charles I, who was placed next to Henry's coffin. King Charles was a Stuart, and Henry VIII during his reign would bar the Stuarts from ever becoming the kings of England. But after his daughter Elizabeth I had no children or heirs, the Stuarts became also the rulers of England. But Charles I is remembered in history for being one of the most brutal and shocking kings who threw his country into civil war. The English Civil War is known as the bloodiest conflict ever fought in England, but Charles I would be placed on trial after the defeat, and he would then be condemned to death, before his head was taken off on Whitehall by an executioner. But because of the furore regarding Charles I and the hostility towards this action, Parliament tried to make sure that they buried Charles I in a quiet place, especially because they were worried that royalists would dig him up and venerate him as a martyr. Because of this, Charles I was quietly buried in Henry VIII's vault, and the vault of Henry VIII was actually rather full, with just Henry and his wife Jane in there. When it came to burying Charles, to get his coffin in, workers had to move Henry's to the side, and it's believed they may have actually damaged this and damaged some of the wood of the Tudor king's coffin. But also another Stuart would be added to this vault, and that was one child born to Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, who was buried also at the feet of Henry VIII in a small coffin. This meant that to lay the enemies of the Tudor monarch in the vault was broken into. But then again, in 1813, the vault would be broken into yet again, as building work was being carried out inside of St George's Chapel and the Royal Vault. The builders entered the vault containing the remains of Henry VIII, but then officials went further and they opened the coffin of King Charles I to see what was inside of it, and the Prince Regent, the future George IV, also oversaw this. However, they noticed that Henry's coffin was in a bad state and had been broken. The trestle it had been sat on was broken and had collapsed, and this was done when Charles's coffin was squeezed in. The pressure from within the body of Henry was also said to have splintered the wood, and the top of the coffin had allegedly split open. But there was no record of any work being done to move Henry into another coffin, which was more suitable, meaning his body may be exposed to the air still today. However, Henry VIII was one of the most notorious and evil kings that had ever ruled England, but he was buried in a quiet place where he did not want to remain forever. He still lies under the floor of the chapel in Windsor, and not in the great tomb that he wanted. But surely his reputation means he deserves a grander monument and tomb than he currently has, as if you visit Windsor today, it is very easy to walk past his burial vault. Mary had been held under lock and key by Elizabeth I, her cousin, for almost 2 decades, but she was sentenced to death for treason as she had plotted against the English Queen and consented to taking the throne after Elizabeth I's planned assassination. Because of this, she was too dangerous for Elizabeth I to keep alive, and with this, Mary's head was struck from her shoulders in a very botched and grisly execution on the 8th of February 1587. But following her death, Elizabeth I did not know what to do with the body and coffin of Mary Queen of Scots, and it was claimed that she regretted ordering the execution. Because of this, Mary's corpse remained unburied until it was, months later, then first interred inside of Peterborough Cathedral in a grave close to the altar opposite the burial site of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. But this was not the final resting place, and she today is interred in a chaotic and rather macabre burial vault in Westminster Abbey that was once described as an awful scene by a man who opened Mary Queen of Scots' burial vault. Today we look at what was found inside of this vault, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. After being buried inside of Peterborough Cathedral for some time, Mary Queen of Scots' son, James I, who had become King of England following her death, arranged for a large tomb monument to be created for his mother inside of Westminster Abbey. Mary had requested to be buried in France alongside the remains of her first husband, but this was ignored, and the burial of her inside of Peterborough Cathedral was done as it was relatively close to the site of her death, but also it denied Mary being buried inside of Westminster Abbey, the place where kings and queens were buried. But James I, her son, then ordered that Mary Queen of Scots should be reinterred inside of Westminster, and her body in 1612 was exhumed from the grave in Peterborough. The coffin was carefully removed and was placed on a cart, ready to be processed down to London for burial in Westminster Abbey. She was interred inside of Westminster Abbey in the October of 1612, and the funeral was said to have been rather large and spectacular. The tomb of Mary Queen of Scots shows her in a recumbent pose and manner, and a huge tomb in the south aisle of the Lady Chapel was constructed for her. It is made from white marble and is under an elaborate canopy. On the tomb, Mary is wearing a close-fitting coif and a lace ruff, and also a long mantle, and at her feet stands proudly a Scottish lion that is crowned. Ornamental railings also surround the tomb, and there is an inscription in Latin on the side. Part of this reminds of her fate, and it says, "May it be forbidden to slaughter monarchs, that henceforward the land of Britain may never more flow with purple blood. May this precedent of the violent murder of the anointed queen come to naught. May the instigator and perpetrator rush headlong to destruction. Should she, after her own death, be vindicated by all the well deposed, then executioners, torturers, gaols and gallows, all would cease. The queen accomplished that journey which the heavenly powers allotted, God bestowed happy times, hard times. Mary Queen of Scots is buried in a burial vault underneath the tomb. Her coffin was placed neatly at the time inside of the vault in the centre, but then over the following centuries, this vault inside of Westminster Abbey became a place which was filled with the coffins of many members of the Stuart royal family, the Scottish royal family of which Mary was the head of. Each time someone died, the vault of Mary Queen of Scots, which was rather large by the standards of Westminster Abbey, was opened, and the coffin was placed inside. Mary's vault was nearby 4 metres long and 3 metres wide, and roughly 2 metres high, and although this does not sound too big, many coffins were crammed and rammed into this chamber. Many of the Queen's descendants, even down to the reign of the last Tudor monarch Queen Anne, were placed inside of this vault. But during the 19th century, and the reign of Queen Victoria, the Dean of Westminster Abbey, Arthur Stanley, began a quest to search of a missing coffin of the Abbey. Dean Stanley was searching for the coffin of King James I, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, as it was not documented where the coffin of the Stuart king was buried. With this he searched many of the burial vaults, and later James I's coffin was located in the burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But during this search, Dean Stanley opened up the burial vault of Mary Queen of Scots, and it was said that he had a rather disturbing surprise inside of the vault, and he later described the sight in the vault as an awful scene, which was shocking. He recorded his findings in a book, and in this he wrote about what he saw. He claimed along the north wall were 2 coffins, much compressed and distorted by the superincumbent weight of 4 or 5 lesser coffins heaped upon them. The upper one of these was that of Mary Queen of Scots, the lower that of Lady Arabella Stuart. No plate, as in a coffin plate, could be found on either, but the upper one, meaning Mary's, was much broken, and the bones, especially the skull, turned on one side, were distinctly visible, thus agreeing that the account of the coffin of Arabella Stuart, a previous search which took place in the vault. The lower coffin was saturated with pitch and was deeply compressed by the 8 above, but the lead had not given way. What Dean Stanley described in these observations was shocking. He claimed that Mary Queen of Scots' coffin was sat on top of Lady Arabella Stuart's, and that this had over the centuries become so damaged that the bones of Mary Queen of Scots could be seen inside of the vault, and that her skin, despite the embalming process, had been decayed inside of the vault. It was later discovered that in fact Mary's coffin was the one below, and that Lady Arabella Stuart's was on top. Mary's head, as it was taken off, probably was sewn back on after her execution, but the indication by the observations showed that her skull had come to one side and had turned over inside of the vault. He also noticed that the coffin on top of Mary's, that of Lady Arabella Stuart, had been covered in pitch, some form of resin, which may have interfered with the decaying process and may have caused further decomposition of the remains, and this would have affected Mary's bones. It was later also claimed by Dean Stanley, speaking about Mary's coffin, that it was of a more solid and stately character, and was shaped to meet the form of the body like another presently to Mary Queen be noticed, which would exactly agree with the age and rank of Mary. The difficulty in removing the whole weight of the chest would itself have proved a bar to any closer examination, but in fact it was felt not to be needed for any purpose of historical verification, and the presence of the fatal coffin which had received the headless corpse at Fotheringhay was sufficiently affecting, without endeavouring to penetrate further into its mournful contents. It cannot be questioned that this, and this alone, must be the coffin of the Queen of Scots. Its position by the north wall, close to Henry, Prince of Wales, who must have been laid here a few months after her removal from Peterborough. Its peculiar form, its suitableness in age and situation were decisive as to the fact. He was in no doubt that the battered and banged coffin was of Mary Queen of Scots. He ended with, on top of this must have been laid Arabella Stuart in her frail and ill-constructed receptacle, and thus for many years those three alone, with the exception of Charles I's two infant children, occupied the vault. Then came the numerous funerals. Mary Queen of Scots' coffin was decayed significantly, but was in a better state than the other coffin inside there of Arabella Stuart. It was stated that Mary's coffin was well constructed and was shaped in a human shape, presumably a round part at the top of the head. However, there were many other Stuarts buried inside of this vault, and a vault stone does note the different people's coffins interred there. It's claimed that Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, Arabella Stuart, 4 children of King Charles I, Elizabeth, Queen of Bohemia, Prince Rupert, her son, Anne Hyde, the first wife of James II, and 10 of his infant children, William, the Duke of Gloucester, and 17 other infant children are all buried inside of this small vault. The space inside of the vault must be incredibly tight, and each time the vault was opened, it could have led to further damage to Mary Queen of Scots' coffin. Today, the tomb of Mary Queen of Scots can be visited and walked around, and it is one of the greatest tombs inside of Westminster Abbey. She was interred close to the site of Elizabeth I, directly opposite, showing even in death that the pair are rivals. Mary was subjected to a terrifying execution, and she went to her death with dignity. But the chaos inside of her burial vault still exists today, as many other coffins are rammed into this alongside the crumbling coffin of the executed Queen of Scots. The first wife of King Henry VIII was Catherine of Aragon, and she is deemed in history to have been very unfairly treated. She was pushed outside in her marriage to the king as Henry's eyes wandered towards Anne Boleyn, one of her ladies-in-waiting, and Catherine would fight for her status as a queen. Her husband Henry demoted her eventually to that of a Dowager Princess of Wales, due to the fact she had married Henry VIII's brother Arthur Tudor, who died inside of Ludlow Castle, shortly after they themselves had tied the knot. But Catherine would have a very tough end to her life, as following being banished from the royal apartments, she was virtually held under house arrest inside of Kimbolton Castle. But what is captivating is that Henry VIII would order a huge tomb for his first wife, who he then hated, to be buried. But then this was desecrated. However, 200 years after her death, the coffin of Catherine of Aragon was disturbed and was opened. What those people who did this found was shocking. Catherine of Aragon was a queen who would rule England alongside her husband for some time, and she was the longest-standing wife of the notorious Tudor king, but she is buried inside of Peterborough Cathedral today, which is shocking considering her role in history. It would have been expected that she would have been buried inside of Westminster Abbey, but this is not the case. Catherine died inside of Kimbolton Castle on the 7th of January 1535 at the age of 50. But Henry had a lot of input with regards to the funeral of his first wife, and he would later complain about the amount of money he spent on it. Henry chose Peterborough Cathedral for a number of reasons, as this was relatively close to the place where she died, and he ordered that Catherine should be buried with all of the honours of a Dowager Princess of Wales, meaning that she was demoted to the wife of the deceased Prince of Wales, as in the wife of his brother Arthur. This was a huge disgrace when compared to the work she had done as the Queen. For her funeral there was a large state procession with many noble ladies there to take part. There was a lot of black cloth provided for the women to wear mourning veils and other garments, and Henry VIII would bemoan the cost he spent on his first wife's funeral, and because of this he made sure that he did not spend a lot of money on the memorial or the burial. Catherine is not necessarily buried in a grand or ornate tomb, but simply under the floor. More on this shortly. It was said for her burial arrangements that the right excellent and noble princess, the Lady Catherine, daughter to the right high and mighty Prince Ferdinand, the late King of Castile, and late wife to the noble and excellent Prince Arthur, brother to our sovereign Lord King Henry VIII, and she would be buried with this title. She was now considered the sister-in-law of Henry VIII, and she was not in death referred to as a queen. Her body was embalmed, and her vital organs had been removed and buried elsewhere from her body, and preparations were made for the funeral in many ways. Clothing and veils for the mourners and ladies of the household of Catherine were made, and, as mentioned, this cost Henry VIII a lot of money, and for this he complained, and he would then refuse to pay any more, and he kept Catherine's funeral service simple and straightforward. Her procession to the place of burial began at Kimbolton Castle, and the body had been placed in a thick coffin, and her remains inside of this were encased in lead, and they had also, it's believed, placed her entrails in a separate chest. They were wrapped in cerecloth, a thick wax cloth that would preserve the body well. When it left Kimbolton Castle, the procession was large, and the hearse was pulled to Saltrey Abbey, where it rested for the night before it continued on to Peterborough Cathedral, or Abbey as it was known. The coffin of Catherine of Aragon arrived and was carried into the cathedral, which had been richly decorated with symbols of the deceased Catherine and the English monarchy. The man who led the funeral service and preached the sermon was John Halsey, who would replace the executed Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher. He would preach a sermon with Henry VIII, who had involvement in, and he would tell lies that denounced her, and he claimed that during her final moments Catherine said that she was not a queen and had never been the rightful Queen of England. This was seen as distasteful and disrespectful, and the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who would have told the emperor about this, was kept away. Henry VIII, following her burial, would create a fine tomb for his first wife, despite the fact he hated her by this point, and he delivered on his promise to give her a decent burial, despite the pro-Anne Boleyn propaganda. Nothing of this tomb remains, as during the English Civil War, parliamentarian soldiers destroyed it and caused chaos inside of the cathedral. However, what is shocking is that in the 18th century there was an exhumation of Catherine of Aragon's coffin that took place, and her coffin was opened and sadistically tampered with and disturbed. There were no real, legitimate reasons to disturb the resting place of a queen who had by this point been buried over 200 years. There had been rumours for many years that Catherine of Aragon was not buried alone, and some believed that she was actually buried with Catherine Willoughby, a prominent Tudor woman who, some believed, could have even become at one point Henry VIII's seventh wife. But this was then investigated, and to do this in 1777, officials inside of the cathedral decided to open the tomb of Catherine. They lifted the flagstones which were under where the tomb had been destroyed, and they opened the grave. The grave was opened, and the investigators discovered that there was only one coffin, and this was Catherine of Aragon. There were no other coffins. However, officials decided that to open the coffin would have been disrespectful and unnecessary. However, one of the witnesses took matters into his own hands. He was armed with a drill, and he would place this on the coffin, and he then drilled a hole into the coffin of Henry VIII's first wife. And after this, he slid a wire into the opening he had created. This had a hook on it, and he pulled and hooked a part of the black and silver fabric which Catherine had been buried inside of. He took this part of her clothes from her body, ripping them, and then when he brought the hook out of the coffin to inspect it, he noticed there was a distinct smell of embalming fluid which still remained centuries on. But when the fabric emerged from the coffin, it hit the air and disintegrated and perished. This was the only time that Catherine of Aragon's remains were broken into, and the coffin was then reburied, and in later years modern tombs have been made for her, with the last being a Victorian one, which links her to being a Queen of England. However, what is bizarre is that the coffin of Catherine of Aragon was drilled into and damaged, and this small hole caused a huge amount of damage to her body. It's believed that as her body was now exposed to the air, that a significant amount of decomposition would have happened to her remains, and that the embalming fluid to keep the former wife of Henry VIII's remains preserved well was in a battle against the elements and exposure. This is a shocking thing that witnesses have caused so much damage, but has never been held accountable for. At the end of her life, Catherine of Aragon was held under virtual house arrest, and she would be banished from royal court by her husband, Henry VIII. Henry's treatment of Catherine in her later life was a stark contrast to the early happy marriage that they had, and he was drawn towards younger women at court who he had his eye on. But Catherine would have her coffin broken into by a curious official who caused a significant amount of damage when visiting Catherine's burial place today. You notice there is no huge tomb or effigy of her, just a simple slab that marks her site of burial. Henry VIII is remembered today as the notorious Tudor King of England who had 6 wives, and 2 of these would lose their heads inside of the Tower of London. But Henry VIII's final wife was Catherine Parr, who many believed nursed the king in his final moments before he died. However, Catherine was a woman who, despite being a survivor, could very easily have experienced execution herself. She came close to losing her head or being burned at the stake as a heretic for being too radical in her religious beliefs. But following Henry's death, Catherine Parr scandalously married quickly. But following giving birth to a daughter, she succumbed to death herself, and she was buried closely to the rooms where she passed away inside of the walls of Sudeley Castle. However, her coffin was broken into and disturbed a number of times, and what those who broke into her remains did was shocking and harrowing. Catherine Parr was believed at the time of the Tudor period to have been a too radical Protestant, and many inside of Henry VIII's government believed she was leading the king down a path of more ruthless religious changes, and she was not the most popular woman. She was a woman who had married before, and Henry's final wife was very different to his other wives, and she was more of a scholar than a doting wife. She married Henry VIII inside of Hampton Court Palace on the 12th of July 1543, and was made the first Queen of England, who was also made the Queen of Ireland. She was the Queen up until Henry's death, and she had throughout her life even acted as the regent whilst the king was away in France. She involved herself in educating the future Elizabeth I. However, after the king's death, Catherine Parr fell in love again with Thomas Seymour, the first Baron Seymour of Sudeley, and he was sniffing around for more power. The pair had a long history together, and Seymour saw his opportunity to marry the new Dowager Queen as a way of getting closer to the throne. His brother Edward Seymour was made the Lord Protector of Edward VI and the chair of the boy king's Regency Council, and Thomas Seymour was very jealous about this. Edward Seymour was now acting almost as a king. However, Catherine Parr and Thomas married in secret, but when the information about this came to light, there was a huge scandal. Catherine's actions in accepting marriage so shortly after Henry's death were seen as shameful and disgraceful, and Edward VI was not impressed with this, and Catherine then joined forces with her new husband to take on Edward Seymour. However, despite never being pregnant before or having any children, she became pregnant with Seymour's child, and at the time childbirth during the 16th century was incredibly risky. It could be a death sentence for a woman, and Catherine's risk was heightened as she was slightly older. Complications could have been fatal. At the time, she was living inside her husband's castle, Sudeley, and she continued to help educate Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, whilst being pregnant. But then she entered her bedchambers to give birth to a daughter, who arrived on the 30th of August 1548. But Catherine Parr never recovered from childbirth, and on the 5th of September she died inside of her rooms days after giving birth. After her death, Thomas Seymour left his castle, and the funeral was arranged, and it would become historic, as it was the first fully Protestant service to occur across England. The chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey, and Catherine's body was embalmed inside of her bedroom by physicians, and it was then taken inside of the chapel, St Mary's Chapel, next to the castle, and she was prepared for burial. She was to be buried in a huge ornate tomb that was made for her, and was then placed on the north side of the chapel, and on this tomb was an effigy of Catherine, and it had a Latin inscription on the bottom of it. However, Catherine Parr's remains were disturbed many times over the following years, and her coffin was shockingly broken into. In 1642, the tomb of Henry VIII's sixth wife was destroyed during the English Civil War as Roundhead forces of Parliament's army smashed up the chapel and desecrated her monument as she stood for monarchy. However, her body was also disturbed, and the grave was smashed to pieces and dug up, and it was said that "There is in the castle a godly fair church. Here they dug up the graves and disturbed the ashes of the death. They break down the monuments." However, in 1782, a number of people arrived at Sudeley, and a group of ladies who had an interest in history wanted to find the remains and tomb of Catherine Parr. Inside of the chapel, they found a block of alabaster marble in the north wall from her tomb, and some men dug underneath it, and they came across the lead-lined coffin of Henry VIII's sixth wife. These group of people then opened the coffin, and what they found was remarkable. They found Catherine Parr's body wrapped tightly in a cerecloth, a heavy wax dipped in cloth which had been almost mummifying her to preserve her. They saw her face for the first time in 2 centuries. However, as her corpse was exposed to the air for the first time, the colour of Catherine's face drained, and her eyes turned a different colour, and lost their sparkle. The women then asked the men, after their curious outing, to rebury her body inside of the coffin. But a local farmer found out about what had happened inside of the church nearby, and he tried to inspect the body of Henry VIII's sixth wife himself. It was said that, in the summer of the year 1782, the earth in which Q.K. Parr lay interred was removed at the depth of about 2 feet, or very little more. Her leaden coffin was found quite whole. Mr. Lucas had the curiosity to rip up the top of the coffin, expecting to discover within it only the bones of the deceased. But to his great surprise, he found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloth linen, entire and uncorrupted. His unwarranted curiosity led him to make an incision through the cerecloth, which covered one of the arms of the corpse, and the flesh of which at the time was white and moist. He made an incision and uncovered one of the arms, and he said that the flesh was white and moist, and he also cut off a few locks of the Queen's hair, as well as some material from her cloth and dress which was buried in. In 1783, just a year later, the steward of the castle then directed for the grave to be opened again to see the Queen's remains, and it was said that the body had begun to decay quickly. It was also noted that the shoes were on the feet which were very small, and that the Queen's proportions were extremely delicate, and that her hair was gold. 4 years later, the coffin of Catherine Parr was yet again opened. This time it was a curious local priest who wanted to see the state of her body, and he had found that the head of Catherine had totally decayed, and presumably no skin was left. He also found that teeth had fallen out of her mouth, or may have been pulled out by those hungry to take a souvenir of the wife of Henry VIII. However, he also found when inspecting the remains that her hands and arm had turned brown, and he made a short sketch of what he saw in her body. He then covered up the body, but 6 years later, one of the most shocking parts of Catherine's desecration occurred. A group of drunk vandals entered the chapel, and they then disinterred Catherine Parr out of the coffin and messed around with it, and one man even danced with the corpse of Catherine Parr. They then dumped the body of her in the corner in a pile, making off with some more teeth, and one man allegedly even stabbed an iron bar through the torso of Henry VIII's final queen, and then had buried this in the ground upside down. Hearing of this, a local priest then appealed to Queen Victoria to give Catherine Parr a better and deserved burial in a final monument where she could finally be laid to rest after centuries of desecration. It was agreed that Catherine would be buried inside of a new coffin and a new tomb, which was made from stone, and she was interred in safety. When the time came to rebury her inside of the newly renovated church within the grounds of the castle where she died, it was found that Catherine's body was just a pile of bones now, with a smaller part of flesh and hair on her body. But she was then buried inside of this new tomb where she still lies today, in decency. The horrific story of those people who opened the coffin of Catherine Parr were a mix of criminals and curious, and she was in death not given the respect that she deserved, but she is a woman who is considered a survivor of the brutal reign of Henry VIII, but she could have experienced execution herself. But what happened to her coffin over the centuries was shocking and barbaric. Inside of Westminster Abbey, for over 400 years, a Queen of England was left unburied. Royal burials were usually huge, spectacular events. For example, the funeral of Elizabeth I, which brought an end to the Tudor period, was huge and incredible. Henry VIII's funeral, for example, even had to see roads being widened for it to pass by, and he would then be buried inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Henry VIII wanted to be interred in a huge tomb, but this would never happen, as the tomb was never finished by his children following his death. But Henry VIII's great-grandmother would be subjected to a harrowing afterlife in which her corpse and remains were treated terribly after her death. Catherine of Valois is remembered today for being the Queen of England, who was left unburied for 400 years inside of Westminster Abbey. But what is the story of her harrowing treatment? Catherine of Valois was the queen and wife of Henry V of England, the warrior king who was said to have been one of the greatest to ever rule over the nation. Henry won spectacular victories against the French at the Battle of Agincourt during the 100 Years' War, but negotiations occurred to marry the English king to Catherine, who was a French princess, and the plan was to combine the two thrones of England and France, with the future children and heirs being the king of both nations. But when Catherine was pregnant with her second child, her husband, Henry V, became very ill, and he was sick. At this time, Catherine was just 21 in a foreign country, and she was now a dowager queen and was the mother of King of England and France, Henry VI. Catherine was now a wanted woman, and she was seen as a possible wife for many nobles because they wanted to be the power behind the King of England, the child of Catherine. But she did have a relationship with Owen Tudor, the keeper of her wardrobe, and they later got married and they had many children. It was this that gave the Tudor family the links to the throne that they would later exploit. However, on the 3rd of February 1437, after giving birth, Catherine of Valois died. She passed away from complications from childbirth, and she'd been ill for a while and had even gone to Bermondsey Abbey for prayer and possible treatment. But Catherine was given a huge funeral, despite the scandal with her marriage, and she was embalmed and her internal organs were removed after death to prevent decay, and then her chest cavity was stuffed with spices and herbs. Catherine's body was then wrapped in a thick and heavy material cerecloth, which was dipped in wax, and her body was then encased in lead before it was placed into a wooden coffin. The organs of Catherine were removed and they were then placed inside of different jars and boxes, and they were buried in different locations to the rest of her body. During the funeral procession, an effigy showing Catherine of Valois was placed on top of the coffin, and it showed the Dowager Queen dressed in her fine clothes, and this was painted to look as realistic as possible, and it shows Catherine as a tall woman with blue-grey eyes. The wooden effigy was, for many, the first time they'd seen any image of the Queen and former wife of Henry V. But Catherine was then given a second funeral service on the 8th of February 1437, 5 days after her death, and she was laid to rest in an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey, close to the tomb of her husband, Henry V. Now this could have been the end of Catherine of Valois' story and account in the history books. However, she would then, for the next few centuries, be subjected to a horrific ordeal. The tomb she was placed in was temporary, as Henry VI, her son, wanted to make a huge memorial for her, but he died before this could occur, and Henry VI had also been deposed during the Wars of the Roses. But Henry VII, Catherine's grandson, would then demolish the old Lady Chapel where she was buried, and he planned to build a new one which would become a big Tudor mausoleum. However, during the work, the tomb of Catherine was destroyed, and Catherine of Valois' body was unearthed as new foundations of the chapel were dug up. Catherine's wooden coffin, which had been interred below ground for around 50 to 60 years, had been decaying, and the wood had rotted a lot. Her remains were then taken out of the coffin, with the coffin being opened, and they were even taken from the lead-lined inner coffin. Her remains were then placed into a wooden chest, which was then covered over roughly with lead from the old roof of the chapel. This new coffin or box, containing the former queen's remains, was then laid near to the feet of her husband's tomb, and it would be left there unburied for around 300 to 400 years. Henry VII may have ordered this to distance himself from his relatives and Catherine's scandalous marriage to Owen Tudor. He said that, "In our monastery at Westminster rests our noble progenitors and blood, and specially the body of our great dame of right noble memory, Queen Catherine, wife to King Henry V, our body therefore to be buried within the same monastery, that is to say, in the chapel where our said great dame lay buried." It seems he envisioned the Lady Chapel as a family tomb for all the Tudors. But Henry VII died before the Lady Chapel could be finished, and his successor, the infamous six-wived King Henry VIII, did not bury his great-grandmother Catherine of Valois. Neither did any of the other Tudors. The chest she was put inside of had a lid in 2 parts, and people would be shown her remains if they paid a small fee, and tourists came into Westminster Abbey, and even pulled back the cerecloth showing her face. It was said that, the bones being firmly united and thinly clothed with flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather, and visitors to the abbey said she had bare skin and was buried naked with no clothes, except for her cerecloth shroud. Some tour guides even made money from this, and Catherine of Valois was becoming a morbid tourist attraction. Lots of people who witnessed her body would go further, though, and they would flock to Westminster Abbey to even touch and at times kiss her body. The famous London writer and diarist Samuel Pepys even kissed her corpse, and he wrote on this: "On Shrove Tuesday, 1669, I to the Abbey went, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of the body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen. And this my birthday, I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen." So people would flock to the abbey to kiss the corpse of the queen, and this became a tradition. But there was much more further horrific actions taken against her life, and it was said in the 18th century that her body had been ripped to pieces by a group of young scholars. It was said the queen's body was a shapeless mass of whitish colour, and it had much stolen from it. People had taken her teeth, and some of her bones would later be taken. However, in 1788, the remains were placed inside of a vault for around 100 years. But then during the reign of Queen Victoria, her vault was opened and people broke in to see if her body was really there in the Villiers vault. But they found the remains of her on top of a pile of coffins, and the wooden coffin of Catherine of Valois had been placed inside of, yet again rotted, and it was in a bad way. It had stuck to another coffin, and the people managed to free it, but when it came out into the air, the wood perished. However, when Catherine's body was looked at again, there was a lot missing. Some said it had been covered in lime, and several parts of it had decayed, and the front part of her skull had gone missing, and one part of the back of this was found lying on her pelvis. A lot of her backbones had been stolen, as were all her ribs but one, along with 2 of her arm bones. Souvenir hunters had taken a lot of her remains, and her legs were found in perfect condition, still wrapped in the 12 layers of cerecloth which preserved them hundreds of years later. The coffin was replaced, and her remains were then placed into it. A witness who saw it being carried into Henry V's chapel said, It was a striking and impressive scene which I shall ever remember, and which at the time it was impossible to view without some feeling of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains, and followed Mr. Poole and the clerk of the works, the latter carrying in his hands 1 small lantern to light us, led us way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Scarfe and myself followed. No one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall into a sort of processional order. I remarked to him, "We are attending the Queen's 3rd funeral." Not a word was said as we passed slowly round the ambulatory in the darkness. Her remains inside of a thick English oak coffin were marked by an inscription showing the bizarre journey her remains had been on. They built a new tomb near to the altar, and in Henry V's chapel her remains were laid to rest 400 years finally after the death of Catherine of Valois. The inscription marked, "It is the latest royal tomb in the abbey, and though long delayed, it has been thought that the singular and romantic history of a French princess and an English queen should at length be brought to an honourable end. Requiescate in pace." Catherine of Valois' body and remains were subjected to a horrific treatment in the years after her death, and people even kissed her decaying remains hundreds of years after she succumbed to death. It was a horrific thing, and people inside of Westminster Abbey even tried to make money from the unburied Queen. Yet she never deserved this, and she was a queen who was not given any respect following her death.